documentation up, what I'll have you do is go ahead and scroll down to about page 6, and you're going to see some examples of these styles of shoes I'm talking about. So you see the slipper style of shoe, there's the first one. Relatively simple pattern. You know, it's usually just one piece of leather cut out into the shape you need and then sewn onto the sole. Excuse me. Your gillies, again, it's a relatively simple shoe. You cut out your pattern, you add your lacing, and it binds onto your foot. You can tighten or loosen the lacing to fit different feet. So that's a much more universal shoe. You can see the bag shoes I was talking about. You can see, you know, this particular style is a slightly more complicated bag shoe where they have put a seam in on the front and on the back just to make them a little bit tighter. But there's no separate sole, there's no shaping to the foot, anything like that. You're just really coming up with a very basic foot covering for yourself. Your buckled slippers, you're getting a little bit more complicated. That's usually a 2 or 3 piece pattern. But again, it's not wildly finicky. It's not a lot of different shaping pieces because you're relying on that buckle to be one of the things that really shapes the shoe to your feet. And if you scroll on to the next page, you'll start to see where we get a bit more complicated. When we're getting towards the ankle boots, both with a buckled closure or a toggled closure, there's more shaping involved in the pattern and more complicated ways to basically attach the foot to your feet and keep it from coming off. And then we start getting into the laced boots, either with just punched holes for your lacing to go through, or the woven style lacing, which basically that long piece of leather you're using for the lace, that's actually part of the shoe pattern itself. It's not, excuse me, it's not a separate leather thong that you've attached on there. And that's as we start to get more towards the later periods is where you start getting these tall boots. You're starting to get into slightly more complicated sandals and the things like the Chopins, which are the really tall overshoes and stuff like that. I just wanted to go over that briefly with you guys so that you've got a visual in your head when we're talking about shaping of the shoes and the complexity level and things like that. So does anyone have any questions so far? Does that make sense for everyone? Feel free to unmute yourself or go ahead and send a message in the chat. Just let me know if you've got any questions before we get into how we construct and mend the shoes themselves. Looks like no questions so far. So what I'm going to be teaching you guys today is your really basic turn shoe. Now, to make it as simple as possible for you, one of the things I've attached on in my handout there is a link to a fantastic fellow Scadian who put together a shoe printout. And it has 3 or 4 different really basic shoe patterns. And basically what you do is you go on and you print it out on your own computer, and you're going to want to make sure that when you print it, you have the page set to print at 100%, the settings in the document itself. And what you're going to do with that is there's a couple of pieces of paper that you'll tape together and you put your foot on it and it'll tell you which size of shoe you're making. And then you get the pattern corresponding that size. And you print that out, you cut that out, and then you've got your pattern ready to go. If any of you are going to be trying that, I mean, it's a great thing. It's an amazing resource. I will say from the get-go, when you print it out, go ahead and cut that piece out and put it on your foot and just use like a little bit of masking tape or something and tape it onto your foot. Because if your printer settings are a little bit screwy, you're going to end up making a shoe that does not remotely fit you. And we just want to make sure that before you go to all of that effort, you're definitely getting something that's going to work. One of the things my Laurel said to me when she was teaching me to make shoes was, when you make your first pair of shoes, plan on making 3 shoes. Because you'll make your first one and you'll think this is great, and you'll make your second one, and either you'll screw up something in the second one and then you have to redo it, or you'll make your first one, you'll make your second one, and your first one doesn't seem great any longer because you've learned some new things, your technique's a little bit better, so then you want to remake the first one. So when you're making your first set of shoes, you really want to plan on, you're going to make 2, 3, 4 shoes to get one pair that's just right for you, or you're at least going to have to be going back and just kind of fiddling around with things. And I want to give you guys that head up so that, you know, if you're using that pattern, which is, it's a great resource, make sure that it's going to fit you as well as it can before you cut into that leather, because we all know that leather's not cheap. So my recommendation, and this is through a lot of trial and error, for very beginning making shoes, you're going to want to go ahead and use the sock and duct tape method. But I've got a couple of other things I've learned along the way that really help out. So the basics of this, and again, it goes into it in the handout so you can sort of look into it in more detail. But the basic idea is you're going to get an old sock that you don't need anymore. You're going to put it on. You're going to duct tape all the way around your foot. And then you're basically going to draw a couple of lines to let you know this is the shape of the shoe. I'm going to cut down this one line or these two lines. I can take this off of my foot, cut the sole section away from the upper, and that is the shape I need to put on my leather. There are a couple of pitfalls to this. If you're doing this, first of all, you need to make sure that the sock you're using is not a very stretchy material, or that you have spent time beforehand stretching that sock out as much as it will possibly stretch. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is when you cut that off your foot, it's going to shrink in just a little bit without you noticing. And you're going to trace that onto your piece of cardboard or directly onto your leather. You're going to cut it out, and now you've got a shoe that's too small. And that can be really problematic because sometimes there's just a tiny bit of shrinkage, so you're able to get that shoe wet and stretch out and get it to fit. Other times it's just enough that you can get that shoe on, but it's never going to be comfortable. And no one wants you to be walking around in your shoes that you've worked so hard on and they give you blisters every time. So there's a couple of ways to get around this problem. The best one that I have found is get your sock. Try and have a sock that's as similar as possible to what you will be wearing when you're at events. So if you tend to wear thicker socks at events, make sure you have a thicker sock on. If you like really thin, like breathable socks, make sure you're wearing one of those. Over the sock, you're going to put a plastic bag, just generic grocery store plastic bag. And you're going to basically pull it up tight, scrunch it around your foot so that you've got it as close to your foot as you can. And then you're going to have one of your friends help you, or you're going to do it yourself if you don't have someone to help out. Then you're going to duct tape the plastic bag over your foot. Again, be careful with what duct tape you're using. When you're buying it, make sure that you're able to get a feel for it. If it's one that is really stretchy, it's going to do that same shrinking thing as the sock would, and you're going to have that same problem. So you want to get some of the duct tape. It's usually the cheaper stuff, to be honest. But you're going to get the stuff that is basically feels really plasticky, and when you kind of stretch it, it doesn't stretch out much. It's just, kind of solid. You're going to use that for your patterning because, again, it's going to minimize the amount of shrinking on there. You're going to tape that all over your foot, and depending on what style of shoe you're making, you're going to draw yourself a couple of lines. The first line we want you to draw is we want you to stand up and really put pressure down on your foot so that your foot is as flat as it can be on the ground. And you're going to get someone to take your marker pen and just around the very bottom edge of your foot, draw a line. You know that anything above that line is your upper and anything below that line is your sole. And again, depending on the style of shoe you're making, you're either going to have one line that goes down the front of your foot to either the center of your foot, or some people like it on a slight curve to the top of their big toe. Or you might have a line that comes from kind of the center down the side, so that you've got one line coming here and then another one at a 90-degree angle coming to the inside or outside of your foot. What this is doing is allowing you to basically cut the pattern so that it will be the exact same as the way the shoe is sewn together to go on your foot. Again, as a slight warning for this, if you can possibly have a really small pair of sewing scissors, a pair of surgical scissors, something like that for when you're cutting this pattern off your foot, you're gonna save yourself a lot of heartache. And even if your husband is like me and thinks he can be very gentle and do a great job cutting that off of your foot for you, he may cut your foot. And so if you can possibly do it yourself, it tends to be better.
Yeah, thanks.
You're going to learn a lot faster when you're hitting skin. Once you've got that cut off, you're basically going to Take your sock off your foot, you've got your bare foot now, you're going to have a lot of excess plastic bag sticking out. You can go ahead and trim that away. All you need is the parts of the plastic bag stuck to that duct tape. That's what's giving you your pattern. You're going to get this and get yourself some cardboard. Thin cardstock, an old box from Amazon, whatever works. And you're going to spread your pattern out on this. Now here's another really important note from experience. When you spread it out, look at the side that's the plastic bag. Remember, that's the inside of your shoe. Flip it over, and on the side that's the shiny duct tape, you're going to take your marker pen and you're going to write left foot outside or right foot outside. And when you put that on your cardboard, you're going to put the outside facing up towards you, flatten it all out really nicely so that it's as stretched as can be. You're going to trace your pattern on there, and you're immediately inside where you've traced that pattern going to write left foot outside, right foot outside. Because I guarantee you, you're going to get halfway through sewing a shoe if you don't do that and realize you're sewing two left shoes.
Angus, we have a couple questions if you are at a good spot.
Yep.
The first one was, did women wear boots?
It really depends on the individual culture. If you're looking at, say, like Anglo-Saxon, Saxon and Norman culture, what we have to go on are some illustrations and some statues and things like that. And they're normally showing upper class women who are doing indoor sorts of things. You don't really have a lot of illustrations of like upper class Anglo-Saxon women trudging through the fields. And when you do, it's sometimes an idealized version. The same way as, when you look at, say, old-fashioned prints from the Victorian era or from the Regency era, they're very stylized. It's not necessarily what people actually look like, and they don't show all the great details. When you're getting to places like, some of the Middle Eastern cultures, the Viking cultures, things like that, you're starting to see a lot more evidence of women wearing boots, but it does seem to be very culture specific. And it does also seem to be reflected that in general, and again, this is me tarring a lot of history with the same brush, in general, sort of hair boots tend to be men's boots, and slightly lower towards the ankle boots tend to be women's boots until we get into the later period.
Okay,
but again,
awesome.
We there's just some things for which we don't know for sure, and we don't have documentation, and we have to make educated guesses. And I would say, I don't think people back then were idiots. And if you had a woman who was going to be out working in a field and it was going to be really muddy, but it was pretty warm weather, she might just say, I'm going to take my shoes off and work bare feet. We know that did happen. But if it was colder weather, she might have been like, no, I need taller boots. And yeah, I'll wear my nice dainty slippers when I'm indoors, but when I'm out here working, I need some boots. We don't know for sure. We can't say either way.
Okay, and we had the awesome suggestion of paper butcher's tape instead of duct tape, which is easier on your scissors and also doesn't stretch. So that's what I wanted to highlight that. And then we also had a question, what exactly is a turn shoe and how is that different from other styles of period shoes?
Okay, so as far as the butcher's tape, it's definitely a possibility. The one issue you do run into with that is that with the duct tape, it has a little bit more flex and give to it, so that when you have sort of multiple pieces where you're having to kind of fold it slightly to get that curve on your foot or whatever, it tends to lay a lot flatter, and it makes it easier when you cut your pattern out to lay that whole thing flat and trace it. It can be a little bit harder with the butcher's tape. It can basically just end up where you've got little bulges that you can't stretch out as easily. The way you get around that is basically if you're trying to lay your pattern flat and you've got a piece that's curved in, you can just take your scissors and just a little bit of a nick in that. It's going to lay your pattern flat, and then you're just going to join up the line from that area that you had to nick.
What happened? Did he tell you to get out?
What was that?
Open? Nothing. Sorry.
As far as what is a tarnished shoe, So specifically, a tarnished shoe basically means a shoe that you turn it inside out. So you're gonna sew the entire shoe inside out, and then either after finishing the seams with like a wood block or something, or after soaking it, you're going to turn it so that it's no longer inside out. It's now the correct way around, and that's your turn shoe. You're turning the shoe to make the shoe from a pattern into an actual shoe. The term is sometimes used just to talk about any shoe that does not have a nailed sole, and it's not quite that simple. Um, there are a number of styles of shoe that are made where they are sewn rather than riveted or nailed or anything like that. But there is no turning section involved. You have your pattern, you're folding your leather over and sewing it. Everything's already on the outside. You don't need to do any soaking, turning, anything like that afterwards. Those are a little bit more complicated to make, and it can be a lot harder to make them so that they will stand up to much wear unless you've really got a lot of experience making them. The good thing about turn shoes is that basically what you're doing is you're stitching it in a way that when you turn it inside out, if you've done it right, most of that stitching or all of that stitching is going to be on the inside of your foot with none of it in contact directly with the ground, which means you're not going to wear away at your stitching and the shoe's not going to fall apart. When you're doing a sewn pattern without that turning section, it can be a lot harder to do that. You just need to have a lot more practice. The other style that a lot of people wear in reenactment, and certainly you did have it, throughout various medieval periods and various cultures, is the nailed or riveted sole. With them generally, and again, this is a big generalized picture because there's a lot of different methods, you would basically have your upper, which is the part that's covering the top of your foot, and then you would have the inside sole, which is kind of like the insole in your modern shoes, and then your outside sole. And basically you would have the upper was nailed or riveted onto the outside sole, and then the inside sole was sewn inside the shoe on top of that, so that you wouldn't have the nails, the rivets wearing away at your feet, but the actual sole that's in contact with the ground all the time, it's not sewn on. That's not going to be in contact with the ground at all. That's a much higher level of shoemaking. It takes a lot more skill, and you tend to need a lot more tools to do that. Does that answer that for you?
We have one more question. If you want to check your pattern and make a mock-up before cutting your leather, do you have suggestions on fabric choices?
Honestly, I kind of like to use just whatever I have scraps of. I prefer something a little bit more heavy duty, mainly because I'm looking for something that's not going to stretch. If I have some lovely soft wool and I sew that into a pattern, that's going to slip onto my foot so nice and easy. It's going to turn perfectly against the sole. It's going to be lovely. You're going to think you've got a great fit. And then when you translate that to leather, you're going to find out that it wasn't actually the right size. It's just because that fabric had more stretch. One of the most recent ones I did a mock-up, and we actually had some old patio furniture that had been given to us 3 years ago. It was falling apart. I threw it out. And the cushions, I was like, well, I mean, there's this old, stained, weathered, has been outdoors for a number of years, like fake, terrible canvas on the outside of the cushions. And I was like, that'll be perfect for making shoe mock-ups because it had absolutely no stretch to it whatsoever. So I knew that when I put that on, I was going to get a pretty true representation of how it would fit with the leather.
Helena suggested felt, which is an awesome suggestion because it's pretty affordable, it drapes really similarly, and it does not stretch because it's not a woven fabric. So yeah, that's a great suggestion.
And again, just as a note on that, it does have to be actual felt for that. The stuff that you often buy as felt at like Joann Fabrics, it's not actual like wool felt material. So depending on which quality level you get, you might get something that's really stretchy and is going to fall apart easily, or you might get something that even if it is acrylic and stuff, it's going to work great. So you're just going to want to get your hands on it and feel it, see how much it stretches, see if you feel like it can hold up to those stitches. So we've given you kind of the really rough overview of what you're going to do. What I'm going to do now is have you again pull up that documentation so that we can kind of look at some of the images and get a little bit of a better idea, because obviously we're not in person. I can't be physically showing you. So I've got a write-up on there that basically goes through exactly what I've said here for you. I want to just kind of jump onto showing you a bit more of how this is going to work. So we go down to
You just say the word if you need me to scroll.
sorry, you're breaking in and out there. I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Can you see your documentation now?
I can, yes.
Okay, so yeah, just give me a holler if you need me to scroll up or down.
Okay, so I want to be scrolling down to the section where it talks about how the letter is stitched. It should have a couple of like paint illustrations.
How's that?
Yep. Okay. So one of the things a lot of people have issues with is how you're sewing the leather together. The easiest way for me to remember it is I think about which side do I want to be the outside of my shoe, both for the upper and the sole. So I usually want the smooth part of the leather on the outside of my sole and the smooth part of the leather on the outside of my shoe. And I have to remind myself that when I'm sewing my shoe together, the parts that I want to be on the outside have to start on the inside. So when you're sewing it, you want to make sure that you've got the parts that are going to be your smooth, lovely outside of your shoe. Those are away from you. Those are, pointing away, that you're looking at, touching, feeling the rough part that's going to be the inside of your shoe. Now, when you stitch this, and this is something that was really tricky for me for a long time, when you're stitching the sole to the shoe, you're going to stitch it in a way that the stitches aren't going to tear through the leather, but also in a way that when you soak that shoe and turn it right way around, you're not going to end up with these big ridges of leather on the inside. So the best method for doing that is you're going to think about this picture here. So you see the way, if you're looking at that, you've got your yellow line here as your stitch. And you're basically having this come at a more diagonal angle through the thickness of the sole and through the upper leather. And the way that I have found is absolutely best to do this when you're really trying to figure out is you're basically just going to take your sole and have it face up towards you. So what is going to be the inside of your sole, that rough leather, have that facing up towards you. And you're going to take your upper and just kind of gently pinch that around the outside. And you're again going to have what's going to be the outside facing out to you. You're going to hold that around your shoe and get that picture in your head. This is what your shoe is going to look like when you're done. At this point, you're going to flip it around so that you've got that inside of the leather facing you. And take some sewing pins. And I know this sounds crazy, but it's going to really help you a lot. So you're going to take, you've got your leather, you've now got the inside facing out, the way it's going to be sewn. You're going to just gently hold the upper against the side of the sole. So you have it kind of at a right angle like this. And take one of those pins and you're going to go in an upwards diagonal motion so that basically you're pushing it so that you're going to be stitching through that hole that the pin makes at some point, and you're going to see that it goes through your upper and then comes out of the sole without it piercing that shiny part. The shiny, smooth part of the sole, the part that's going to be in the contact with the ground, you don't want to see any stitching on there. You want to make sure that when you're pushing that pin through, you're just getting the rough grained leather, so that the shiny part is smooth and lovely and your stitches are not going to be rubbing on the ground. And again, it's really hard to show you guys properly without being able to be physically there. But in just a moment here, I'm going to try and give you an illustration of that. Now, it's going to be really helpful for you for your overall stitching. Once you've got that first pin in, you're basically going to go all the way around. You're going to pin that whole shoe in place. And then what you can do is, as you're ready to stitch, you can just take out 1 or 2 pins at a time, stitch that section. Take out a couple more pins, stitch that section. It's going to help you get a really nice, even tension. And it's also going to help you to make sure that you're not kind of faffing up the pattern as you go. Because if you stitch too tight at one part and then you loosen up your stitches and then too tight and loosen up, when you get to the very end of that flap of fabric, what you end up with is maybe you were too tight for half of the shoe and you've got this extra flap that you don't need. And you think, great, well, I cut the pattern too big. You cut that off, you finish your shoe, you try and put it on. Your foot's not that small. And it's because you didn't have that even stitching. So this really, really helps if you're just able to kind of like do it gradually and have to not pull at the leather and where it's going.
These are just regular sewing pins you're using, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So I'm going to give a little bit of an example here. This is a shoe I made a while ago. And you can see pretty clearly here where the shiny part of the leather is curving upwards slightly and the stitching is on a part that's not in contact with the ground. The method I'm about to show you in a second here, this is what you're aiming for, is to have it so that these stitches are not touching the ground, so that it's not getting worn away and your shoes starting to fall apart as you're using it. So if you give me just a second, I'm going to grab a couple of pieces of leather and a couple of pins and do the best I can to kind of try and show you this method. Okay, I tried to make a video of this for you guys earlier and I just couldn't get it to work in a way that I would like. So we've got 2 scraps of leather here. We've got the more heavy duty one that we're using for the sole, and then just a lighter, more flexible piece of leather that we're imagining is going to be the upper. So you want to think about, I've got my shiny, nice sole piece facing up. That's going to be the outside of my sole. And this is going to be the outside of my shoe. And you can see I'm just pressing them together basically at a right angle. And that is helping me gauge, okay, what thickness of leather do I have here? And how far is my stitching going to go so that when this flips, the shiny part is going to be the part that's in contact with the ground. Once you've kind of visualized that a bit, that's when you can flip it so that you've got your outside pieces facing. So rough leather out here, rough leather here. And what you're going to do is, again, just gently pinching this. I know that this shiny part here, I want that in contact with the ground, not the stitching. So I'm just going to go ahead, roughly the edge of my upper. I'm just going to stick the pin through. And it might take just a little bit of force, but if you've got decent quality sharp pins, it's not that much of a problem. And with this first pin, I'm going to see, okay, here's my shiny part. I want this in contact with the ground. I don't want my stitching. So you're going to go right at the very edge of that shiny part and then just gradually and gently diagonally into the leather. And then I can snug that pin up all the way to the edge. And so now we have our pin holding that in place. And I can go, maybe an inch or so, and I can do it again. So I'm feeling with my fingers, where is the bottom of the sole here? And when I feel where that is, I make, this is my rough idea of where that is in the soft outer leather that's going to be my upper. Again, I put my pin through, and then I can kind of squeeze like this, and I can say, okay, I don't want the shiny part to have stitches in it. I want the shiny part in contact with the ground, the stitches not. So again, I'm going to go very to the edge of the leather, and then just diagonally up and through. And what this is doing is it's giving me a really rough guide for where I'm going to use my awl to make the holes for that stitching. And it also means that when I've done this the whole way around the shoe, then I don't have a bunch of leather flapping around when I try and stitch. My shoe's basically all in place. All I need to do is, as I'm ready to punch the hole with an awl and start stitching, I come and take out 1 or 2 pins at a time. Then you can take your awl. You've already got a couple of guide holes. You go through the guide hole on the outer, and then again diagonally up through that guide hole on your sole, and there you go. You've got your
phone, or it's nonstop. It's weird hours where it's not, because it's not all at once. It seems like less work, but it's so many more hours it took.
Yeah, and it really, these are things that I've learned through a lot of trial and error of making a number of different shoes. And I have arthritis in my hands, and so when I'm hand sewing a whole pair of shoes and I'm trying to sit down and go, okay, I'm holding the leather together, and now I'm punching with the awl, and now I'm sewing, and then the next section, and the next section. And it's physically and mentally exhausting when your hands are starting to cramp up from even a tiny little bit. I've really found that doing this, it saves so much time for me, and it really saves my hands, because I'm not spending a lot of time gripping and pinching at the leather to try and have it held in the same place. And I'm also able to work on a little bit at a time and then let my hands rest, but I'm not worrying about the tension in those stitches slackening off, or the leather starting to come apart and the shape being all wrong, because I know that those pins are holding it in place while I'm not working on it. And it really makes a big difference, and it really is overall such a huge time saver to have something like that. I know a couple of people that they do a cheater version of that, where they basically put super glue around the edge of the sole and glue into place and let that set, and then they come back and just sew it from there. I prefer not to do that, because it makes it a little bit harder if you need to make some little changes at the end. It makes it harder to remove excess leather or add more in if you're having to get through that glue first. So does that make sense for everyone? Okay.
Absolutely. And there was a couple thank yous for the visual on the pinning. That's a really awesome tip. And I know you learned that the hard way.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just said, I know you've learned that the hard way.
Yeah. And again, the pins I use, they're not super expensive. I went to Joann's and I bought the long sewing pins. So they're probably about 2 inches long. And I mean, you can see like they're not ridiculously sharp, but because they're longer, and that means that the shank is slightly or heavy duty than your regular sewing pins, it means you can give it that extra tension. If you're being slow and careful, you can push it through the leather. If you try and jam it through all in one go, you're just going to bend the pin. But it's such a time saver overall that it's totally worth doing.
We got a request to see the finished shoe stitching, and one question, it looks like from your illustration that the thread won't show on the outside of the shoe, that you're only going through the interior portion, but that shoe you showed, you can see the stitching on the outside. So if you've got a couple examples, and you can talk a little bit about that.
And we're going to get there. So with the shoe I showed you before, this is one of my early ones where I hadn't really figured out how to do the tension properly yet. And what you see on this, and this is a really good example of why that pinning method helps, you can see pretty clearly sections where there's just not enough tension and you've got gaps in the leather and the stitching is really just kind of wearing down really badly. You've got other sections like this one here. Let me try and get this in focus for you. So you can see, like, I mean, there's basically a hole there. The leather has turned completely around so that all of the stitching's on the outside. It's really clearly visible, and because it's on the outside, it's allowed all of this gapping. Using that pin method really helps you to keep a solid tension. The difficult part comes when you're doing the turning the shoe inside out. And that's why I really wanted to solidly get you on making sure that when you're stitching it, you've done everything you can to have a nice even tension all the way around, so that when you turn it, that stitching is going to stay on the inside, because this is the difficult part. So I'm going to literally take off the shoe I'm wearing right now to show you. This is one of my more recent ones. And I've been wearing these, just kind of testing them out, making sure that everything's going the way I want after I tried a few methods. And you can see the difference with this one. You don't see all of that stitching. Even the parts of my foot that tend to flex more, you see just tiny little hints of stitching. But overall, that upper is folded around. So what you're looking for, eventually, once you've sewed it all and you've soaked it and everything, what you're going to see is all of your stitching is going to be basically flat against the inside, about maybe an eighth of an inch, eighth to a quarter of an inch from the edge of the leather. That's where you're going to see your stitching. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to stitch this. Now, a lot of people use saddle stitch because it helps you have a more even tension overall on the length of that sole. You can get away with using backstitch. I often, what I'll do, because I'm not great with saddle stitch, I'm not great using two needles at once, I will basically do a running stitch all the way around, and then when I'm sure the shoe is going to fit and everything seems good, I'll go back around the other way and fill in all the gaps, so that I still have a nice even tension all the way around, and I have stitching the entire length of the shoe, but I don't have to faff around with saddle stitch. It is the best option. If you're feeling up to it, go for it. It's gonna provide the best shoe for you, but there are other methods to get around. The main important thing to remember, do not, even though it seems to make so fast and you think it's going to provide you with a really strong sole, do not do a whip stitch. Because if you do a whip stitch, you will end up with basically these big ridges of leather that you cannot flatten down on the inside of your shoe. Now, this is one of the best tips I ever got told, and I probably spent about 4 years looking at different shoemaking tutorials online. I took classes, and no one ever mentioned this. They all said, you make your pattern, you sew your shoe, you turn it inside out and wear it, and you're good to go. When you turn that shoe inside out, even with the best tension stitches in the world, leather is a natural product. There will be sections where the fiber is tougher than in another section of the shoe. And you'll turn it all inside out, and you'll have a section where basically, instead of all turning evenly and smoothly on that stitching line, part of the heavy duty sole is going to not fold out the way it should, and you're going to get a little ridge there, and there's not anything you can do beforehand about it. It's just you're going to find out after you turn that shoe inside out. So one of the things that I learned from a friend in Antier who used to make shoes professionally, and she used entirely modern methods, and then started making SCA shoes and brought some of the things that she'd learned making modern shoes to it. And she's the only person that ever mentioned it. She happened to mention it on a Facebook post, and I was like, oh, so before you soak your shoe, before you turn it right way out, when you've got all of your stitching, you're finished, you've taken all of your pins out, it looks great, you're gonna take a piece of wood, a dowel, an awl, a wooden spoon, whatever you can get your hands on, you're going to take a piece of wood, And you can use pretty much any oil. I like to use beeswax, but you can legitimately use like canola oil, whatever you've got in your fridge. You're just gonna put some oil around the edging of where all your stitching is. You're gonna take your piece of wood and you're just gonna rub it really nice and flat. Just really push it in there until you can see what this looks like. You can see there's the gap between the upper and the sole, but the stitching keeps it really tight and flush at the area that matters. And all of this, smoothing this down and flattening it so that you can see this nice flat smooth edge. This means that when you soak this shoe and you turn it right way around, it's gonna it's gonna minimize any excess pieces of leather that are gonna provide an uncomfortable seam. It really makes a huge difference. So then what do? You've soaked your shoe, you've turned it right way around.
Real briefly, Angus,
Yep.
we are at 5 minutes left, just FYI.
Okay. We're good. So we're almost done with this. Once you've turned it right way around, while the shoe is still wet, this is the critical period. You don't want it dripping wet. You want it so that it's quite damp, but not like still dripping water. You're going to take, again, your wooden spoon, whatever you've got, and you're going to just push down on every one of those leather seams. You're going to go around in the shoe, pressing it all down until you can feel all of those seams are as flat as possible. And then you're going to put on your shoes and you're just going to wear them in the house for a couple of hours. And those shoes are going to mold to the shape of your feet. It's going to make them way more comfortable in the long term, but it's also going to help you as you wear them. Take your piece of wood and really work on flattening that down. That's your basic construction. Since we're low on time, I'm just going to really quickly go over the methodology for repairing your shoes. So we know in period, people got their shoes fixed. There's tons of archaeological evidence. We see a big difference between stores that specialized in fixing your shoes for you and basically reselling old shoes, and stores that made shoes for you. And because of this difference, we have archaeological finds of shoes that have been repaired. The most common problems you're going to have with period shoes, and if you've gone all this trouble to make a pair of period shoes or bought a pair and you wear a hole in the sole, you want to fix them. It's so easy to do. Your most common problems that you're going to have are at the back of your foot, basically wearing a hole, the very back part here. This is really easily fixed. You get a triangle of leather and you basically go in and sew that into the sole itself and then bring it up and sew it onto the back of the shoe. It's going to fix any holes that you've worn in the back of the shoe, and you can also use it as a way to basically refit the shoe. If you're missing a section of leather, you can make sure that you're getting it so it's nice and snug against your heel. The other really big one you're going to get is wearing holes in the sole. So you can see I've worn numerous holes up at the toe. You get them at the back of the heel. It depends on your individual gait. What you're going to do, basically however big your hole is, you're going to feel the leather all around it, see how thin it is. If the leather all around it is paper thin, you're going to need a bigger patch. You find out what size you need to cover. So you can see here, I had a hole about this size. So all around it, the leather was paper thin. I measured out to where the leather was still nice and thick. You cut a patch in roughly the size and shape of that section of your foot. If you do it closer, so that it's wide out towards the edge of the foot, you're going to minimize the amount of rubbing you get from basically walking as if there's something stuck to your foot. And you're going to mark with just a pen, pencil, charcoal, whatever, where you're going to stitch that on. Once you've marked that, you're going to take a little pen knife. You can do this with a fork, whatever you need to do. Get that leather patch slightly damp, and then just gouge a line. You don't want to be tearing into the leather, which is why you want it wet. You just want to press that line in there so that you have yourself a nice little ridge so that you can sew this in, and those stitches are not coming into the contact with the ground. They are now inside this nice little ridge so that those stitches are protected, but you have a nice patch on there that is going to keep your shoe nice and safe and warm. You're not going to have stuff getting in there. So I'm going to try and get in a little bit closer so that you guys can see, if I can get it in focus. So you can just about here, you can see where this little gouged line is. And I literally, I did this patch at Artemisia 20 year, and I got the leather patch wet in the river, and then I used a twig to just push that line in there, and then did all of the stitching from there on. And you can see this is the only section that had to be restitched at any point. That was a field stitching when I suddenly needed a different pair of shoes, and this had come apart at some point. Most of it is going to be really, really nice. It's going to stay in that little valley that you've gouged in there and protect that stitching. Those are going to be your main big fixes. You will sometimes, depending on your gait, have other fixes that are needed. Those are usually right along the outside edge of the shoe here, if you're someone that kind of leans over on the edge of your foot. You're going to do something really similar to what you did with this patch in the back. You're basically going to get your patch of leather. You're going to find a nice, good, solid bit of sole underneath where the hole has been worn and sew it on there. And then again, fold it up and sew it over the hole and around it on the thicker leather that hasn't been worn away. And again, if you can find the best possible thick edge, as close to that edge as possible, it's going to mean you have something that stays on there, doesn't wear down as easily, but also avoids you having bulky pieces of extra leather that are just going to irritate your foot when you walk. Does that make sense for everyone?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angus. Again, this is the attendance link one last time for those who would like to get credit from Artemisia University. It hasn't been finalized exactly where all the videos are going to live, but I think it's a good bet that they'll be on the Kingdom of Artemisia YouTube, so I'm sharing that as well. Is there a good way for people to get in touch with you if they have questions or they want to chat more? Do you want to share an email address or something?
Yeah, sure. If you want to go ahead and just put my email in the chat there. Anyone that wants to take that, feel free to contact me. I am happy to answer any questions.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for everything, and the recording should be up soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for coming along. You guys enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Angus.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.